Unplugged in, the world marks a sobering milestone, the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. But with hate crimes on the rise, how far has the world really come from the dark days of the Holocaust?
We're particularly focused on domestic terrorism, especially racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists.
In the United States, the FBI declares racially motivated violence a threat to national security and compares white nationalist and neo-Nazi groups to Islamic State. Is it possible to eradicate hate and racism? Unplugged in, lessons from Auschwitz. Hello, welcome to Plugged In. I'm Greta Van Susteren. Recently, world leaders gathered in Poland to mark a solemn anniversary. It has been 75 years since the liberation of prisoners at the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz. It is estimated that more than 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and of that 6 million, more than 2 million of the murdered were executed at Auschwitz. Reporter Henry Ridgewell traveled to Poland to speak with one man who survived that death camp.
Along with his photographs and letters, Stanislav Zalewski keeps his memories locked away, occasionally letting them out to share the horrors of the past. Zalewski was 18 when he was arrested for painting Polish resistance symbols on walls in Nazi-occupied Warsaw. After a brutal interrogation, he was imprisoned.
About 37,000 of these prisoners were killed, and about 60,000 were taken from Pawiak prison to concentration camps. I was among these 60,000. I was taken to Auschwitz-Birkenau on October 6, 1943. The procedure was as follows. Registration in Auschwitz I camp, which involved taking personal information, taking off all our civilian clothes, cutting off hair, shaving, tattooing, putting on prison-striped uniforms. We got only a cap, a shirt, a jacket, underwear, pants, and wooden clogs.
Zalewski was tattooed with the number 156569. Guards referred to prisoners only by number. Many new arrivals were taken directly to the gas chambers. Stronger men and women were used as forced labor.
If one of the prisoners did not look fit enough for further work, the SS pointed him out with a stick to the camp writer, who would write down the prisoner's number. Afterwards, these prisoners were called out and taken on foot to the crematorium. One day, lorries arrived at the barracks, and women were led out, ordered to strip naked, and they were loaded as though they were some commodity. These trucks were followed by a soldier on a motorbike as they moved toward the crematorium. I still remember today the screams of these women. The transportation lasted several hours until they emptied the barracks.
Zalewski was imprisoned for his political activities. Most prisoners were Jews sent to Auschwitz to their deaths, the Nazis' so-called final solution to wipe out the Jewish race. Zalewski recalls Jewish prisoners arriving on trains wearing bands bearing the Star of David.
One SS soldier ordered them in one long line, with him standing at the front of the line and leading them forward. They followed this one soldier with no signs of worry or anxiety. They were heading toward the crematorium, but only we were aware of this, not them.
As Soviet soldiers began to approach from the east, the Nazis transferred hundreds of thousands of prisoners to other camps. Tens of thousands died on the journey. Zalewski was taken to the Mauthausen-Gusen camp in Austria. In May 1945, rumors spread of the Allied advance, and German guards fled.
On May 5th, American military vehicles arrived. 2 American soldiers got off. One of them knew some Polish and shouted, "You are free." It took me 78 days to get from Nuremberg to Warsaw. I arrived in Warsaw on July 22, 1945, wearing U.S. Army fatigues.
Zalewski is president of the Polish Union of Former Political Prisoners of Nazi prisons and concentration camps. 75 years on, he still struggles to reconcile what happened.
Jeżeli odmawiam modlitwę Paternoster, po polsku to jest Ojcze Nasz.
When I say the Lord's Prayer, there is a phrase, "Give us our daily bread, and forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who have sinned against us." I face a dilemma at this point. Can I forgive those who had an inscription that read, "God is with us" on their belt buckles, who kill people with cold premeditation? I put my memories of Auschwitz into a box. I tied it with a string and threw it into the water, metaphorically speaking. I worked, I started a family, I have a son and grandchildren. When I visit the camp, or when we are talking like we are today, I pull out this box, I present its contents to you, and afterwards I throw it back into the water. There are moments, however, when these memories break into my psyche, causing reflections and questions with no answers. The world has not learned the lesson of what had happened. The world has come full circle, so to speak. This history, this circularity, is powered by people who do not respect the dignity of another human being.
Zalewski and 200 fellow survivors returned to the so-called gates of hell for the 75th anniversary of the camp's liberation last month, still determined to teach the world the lessons of Auschwitz.
Henry Ridgewell joins us from London. Henry, thank you for joining us. Tell me, what were your impressions or your thoughts interviewing Mr. Zalewski?
I think the first impressions were his incredible recall and his lucidity about what happened 75 years ago. Mr. Zalewski is 94 years old. He's seen the full arc, really, of the latter half of 20th century history, from his early days growing up in Warsaw to imprisonment under the Nazis throughout the Second World War in Auschwitz, as you heard there, and in other concentration camps run by the Nazis. His release after that, and life under Soviet rule, and more recently life in Poland as a member of the European Union, and now renewed worries about the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. So it was just remarkable to speak to a man who could describe his memories in such detail. What you heard there in that report was a fraction of what he spoke of when I met him in Warsaw. He spoke for 2 hours about his memories, many of them very harrowing memories of Auschwitz and of his treatment and of the treatment of the other people, particularly the Jewish people that he witnessed at Auschwitz. So as a journalist, as somebody able to meet someone like that, it was a privilege, and it's one of those unique experiences that I think I will certainly never forget, and I hope in that report it conveys something of the value that people of this generation still hold and need to convey to the rest of the world.
Henry, so much time has passed, 75 years has passed, and and I worry, and I suppose a lot of people worry, that people will not, will lose sight of, what did happen and the lasting impact. What did Europe do? What did the EU do? What did the nations do to commemorate this, to keep this alive?
Well, there was that ceremony in Auschwitz, and there were other ceremonies in several other European cities to mark the 75th anniversary of the liberation, and of course in Israel as well. Just to give you an idea, I'm here in Golders Green, which is a suburb of London. This has a very large Jewish population, and that population grew dramatically after the Second World War, or during the Second World War, as Jewish people fled Nazi rule in Germany and across Europe. And that phenomena happened in countries across Europe, and there are Jewish communities dotted across the continent, of course. After the Second World War, many Jewish people did go to help set up the State of Israel, but there are still surviving Jewish communities thriving here in Europe. But as we've been discussing, many of them say that in the last decade they have become more fearful. A recent survey of European Jewish communities suggested that 89% of Jewish people in countries in Europe felt that anti-Semitism has been on the rise. So while we commemorate these events and that very important 75th anniversary there last month at Auschwitz, bringing this right up to date, there are fears that, as Mr. Zalewski said in that report, those lessons have not been learned.
Henry, Auschwitz is in Poland, but I am certainly curious what, if anything, Germany did specifically, whether Angela Merkel had made any statements or any special acknowledgement of what happened.
Germany is credited Across the world as being one country that has managed to atone for its sins during the Second World War, for the huge crimes against humanity that were carried out not only against the Jewish race but against, of course, other populations as well. And we have had, over the decades since the Second World War, repeated apologies from not only Chancellor Merkel but from other German leaders in history. Of course, there was a famous moment when a German leader got down on his knees and apologized for Germany's conduct during the Second World War. Chancellor Merkel attended the ceremonies to mark the 75th anniversary of Auschwitz liberation as well, and she will be deeply involved in other events this year. Of course, the Auschwitz anniversary event just kicks off several events this year that will mark the 75th anniversary of the end of the Second World War. We have the anniversary of the bombing of Dresden coming up. We have the anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, Victory in Europe Day, Victory over Japan Day. So this is a very big year, and I think you will see the German government and Chancellor Merkel at the center of those events.
Did Mr. Zalewski tell you how tough it was for him to go back to Auschwitz, and was that his first trip back?
No, it wasn't his first trip back. He has made several trips back there, and he makes a point of doing so and being as active as he can, despite being 94 years old, in educating younger generations especially. He does numerous school visits. He travels overseas on several occasions throughout the year. And I think he has managed to process the scale really of the history that he witnessed and the magnitude of those events that he witnessed. What he still struggles to overcome, and what did bring tears to his eyes during that interview, were the images that have stuck with him from his time at Auschwitz. He mentioned there the arrival of the Jewish prisoners with the Star of David on their hands, them arriving with their suitcases in hand, not knowing that they were being taken directly to the gas chambers. He spoke of the treatment of the women who were stripped naked and put on lorries to be taken to the crematoria. And numerous of those details that came out were so harrowing that it was difficult to put them on camera. One last one that sticks in the mind is that when he was freed, many of the prisoners from the camp looted the local shops. They hadn't had much to eat for ages, and they ate so much that their stomachs could not deal with it. They had been starved for years, and the next day they died. It's minor details like that we don't hear about that I think really stick in his mind and the minds of viewers.
Henry, thank you. Henry Ridgewell, VOA Europe correspondent. Thank you, Henry. The videos and photographs of the Holocaust are horrific. Documenting and preserving the many items from that very dark period is vital, and it's also vital to preserve those haunting stories from those who survived the death camps. Gretchen Skidmore is the Director of Civic and Defense Initiatives at the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, D.C., and she joins us here in the studio. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you.
You know, it's just unthinkable, isn't it? I mean, there are just no words. It's like when you go back and you look at these videos, it's hard to describe.
It really is, and that's why we spend a lot of time really thinking about the complexities of the history. So you have to think about, it couldn't have been possible with just a few Nazi leaders. It really involved millions of people, some actively collaborating, some really just acquiescing to what was going on around them, but trying to understand that phenomenon, trying to understand how and why the Holocaust happened, think critically about it, think about the impact that the history of European anti-Semitism had on those events. It's really a complex thing, and we're trying to help educators do that work in the classrooms every day.
But are the classrooms really covering it? I mean, I always wonder if I go out to the street and say it's to, someone, what's the Holocaust? I always wonder, what answer I'm going to get. And of course, when you go to the Holocaust Museum here in Washington, you just see the shoes. It's the people who were executed. It's just unbelievable.
And I do think there is an interest in this subject. We just had a survey from the Claims Conference. 9 out of 10 Americans surveyed said it's important for students to learn this in school. Now, teachers are up against some challenges, right? There are time limits, there's resource limits. So as a federal institution, our goal is to make sure they have accessible resources, that the framing is there for them, that teachers that might not have training in this have the opportunity to really understand it and introduce it to students in a way that they can grasp and that's relevant to them.
Well, as time marches on, I mean, so many of us probably know someone or might know someone who was released from a camp. We're getting beyond that. And that's what I worry about, is that when family members are no longer around to sort of, to remind others, and for those others then to talk to it with other people, I worry about that. 75 years.
So we honor and remember the victims and survivors by encouraging people to study and understand this history. And history education, the Holocaust is always relevant, but I think right now it is particularly relevant. It's a study in human behavior and choices people make and how those choices matter today in their lives.
All right. I don't mean to minimize in any way the Holocaust by asking this next question, but are there any parallels to the anti-Semitism today? Are we seeing, more of a rise in it, or even bigotry in other ways?
So people have always, there's been a long history of hatred, a long history of people being susceptible to misinformation. I think what's changed is the presence and the amplification of this through social media. People are no longer isolated in this. They're in a community now, and that makes it socially acceptable. And so that means we have to meet those trends in society and in human nature. The rise of hatred and the ongoing, sort of presence of that in communities, with awareness, the power of that in the past, and how we need to continue to work all across platforms in order to combat it today.
And so social media is almost an accelerant.
It is. It's an amplifier.
Any thoughts on how to sort of reverse that, have an amplifier to do just the opposite?
Well, we have a very active Instagram page, for example, Reach Youth Where They Are. That's where they go for information. That's where we post about history of anti-Semitism, the role it played in the Holocaust, key facts about understanding enough about that phenomenon to recognize it today and to be able to think critically. What am I seeing? What should I do about that? What's my range of responses on that? And we have to be where they're going. And so social media, other platforms, YouTube, other things that are on our website are an opportunity for people to engage in the facts of the history and how it can inform their understanding of today.
It's so horrible that when you see these videos, you think that this couldn't possibly be, in the sense that because it's so horrific, so evil.
But I think that we can't change human nature, but we can respond and we can change how we set up structures that educate people to see the dangers when hatred is unchecked. And that's what we learned from the history of the Holocaust.
Well, and let me say again, my next statement is not to minimize what happened in the Holocaust, because it stands alone. But I tip my hat to the museum, because the Holocaust Museum here in Washington is one of the few entities that has condemned as genocide what has happened to the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar as they got pushed out into Bangladesh.
So when you look at early warning indicators in societies that help us not only respond once there have been group-targeted violence, but also to get people to understand that we can look for these indicators and prevent some of these things, that's the mission of the museum.
But it's interesting how, everyone said never again, but we've had Rwanda and now we have this. I mean, there is sort of, there's a little bit of, looking the other way.
But we can also recognize that there are structures that are possible to implement both in the United States government, and a lot of the work of our centers at the museum are about engaging governments in setting up structures that recognize these things and respond early.
You said in terms of helping educators in questions of time. You're saying that the teachers don't have the time in the classroom?
Sometimes they don't have time. Sometimes
how can you not have time for something that's so important, because it has so many branches in terms of history is important. We learn from past behavior, so we don't repeat behavior, so we can take appropriate action.
There's a lot of pressure on teachers to cover a lot of subjects, and certainly there's an appropriate emphasis on STEM. There's things that must be covered, right? But we know that the history of the Holocaust, the history of Western civilization, the history of the world is being taught in a lot of different disciplines now. It may not just be the history classroom. It might be the English classroom. It might be civics. It might be, sort of political science. It might be sociology. So what we're trying to do is make sure that all of those educators see that the history of the Holocaust and an understanding of these types of events, hatred in communities, and the history of anti-Semitism, they can be incorporated into other disciplines and courses.
Well, I have to give a shout out to the museum, because it does help capture the atrocities and educate just by going through the museum. Anyway, Gretchen, thank you.
Thank you.
Gretchen Skidmore, U.S. Holocaust Museum here in Washington. And as noted, it's been 75 years since the gas chambers in the Holocaust, and yet the neo-Nazi movement is alive. One man, once a member of a neo-Nazi punk rock band, is trying to change that. Today, Christian Picciolini is the author of several books and the founder of the Free Radicals Project, which aims to free radicalized youth from the same racist views he once held. Plugged In's Mil Arcega spoke with him on Skype.
Christian Picciolini is an expert on hate.
In 1987, I was recruited into America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group.
Picciolini's testimony to Congress in 2019 was just the latest step in his transformation that began as a discontented teenager from a loving and hardworking immigrant family.
So I went searching for a sense of identity, community, and purpose, sort of on the fringes, having been bullied for most of those 14 years. And on those fringes, I found a narrative. A man walked up to me in an alley when I was 14 years old, and I was smoking a joint, and he pulled the joint from my mouth, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." And I have to be honest, at 14, I didn't know what a communist was, or even if I'd met a Jewish person, or even what the word docile meant. But it was the first time in my life that I felt that someone had actually seen me, that had included me.
He stayed with the movement for 8 years.
I started a record store in 1995 to sell racist music that I was importing and making as well. But at that record store, I was also selling different kinds of music, things like punk rock music and hip hop and heavy metal. And I started to meet people who were Black and who were Jewish and who were gay for the first time, really, and having meaningful interaction with them. So over the course of having that record store, I started to really challenge the demonization that was happening in my head with humanization. And it was those people that I'm so grateful for, because they knew who I was, and yet they still chose to challenge me with compassion. And it was the compassion that I received from them at a time when I least deserved it. That was the most powerful, transformative moment for me.
Picciolini has written several books about his journey and founded an organization called Free Radicals to give young people better options than the pull of extremism.
What I'm seeing with white nationalism today is very similar to what I saw in the early days of, let's say, Al-Qaeda or ISIS. The propaganda tactics are the same. Recruitment is very similar. The use of high-quality, marketing videos showing kind of this hope of glory if you join the fight.
Picciolini says he's trying to be the person he wishes would have approached him when he was just 14 years old. So many years ago. Mil Arcega, VOA News, Washington.
Christian is one example of someone who turned his hate around. But violence, hate, xenophobia, they're growing in some places in some countries. Deadly shooting sprees in El Paso, Texas, and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, have prompted the FBI to declare domestic attacks as dangerous to U.S. national security as ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
A majority of the domestic terrorism cases that we've investigated are motivated by some version of what you might call white supremacist violence, but it includes other things as well. We are particularly focused on domestic terrorism, especially racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists. Not only is the terror threat diverse, it's unrelenting.
Just as the number of hate crimes has risen in some parts of the world, one thing remains a constant, and that is the fight against it. Joining us from New York is Oren Siegel of the Anti-Defamation League. Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Mr. Siegel, who is Vice President of the ADL Center on Extremism, combats anti-Semitism, and he leads a training initiative for law enforcement, public officials, and companies in the private sector. Mr. Siegel, first of all, what is the Anti-Defamation League?
Well, the ADL is an over 100-year-old organization whose mission is to not only stop the defamation of the Jewish people, but to secure justice for all. Much of our work is focused on combating extremism and hate wherever and whenever it arises.
Have there been an uptick in attacks for anti-Semitic attacks and extremist action like that?
Because in the past, year and a half, we have seen the deadliest attack against the Jewish community in American history in Pittsburgh, and that was followed 6 months to the date in Powell. More recently in Jersey City and in Muncie, New York, we've seen Jews being attacked because they are Jews. You combine them with rise in hate crimes. In general, the golden white supremacy in this country, we are in a unique moment in time.
And what is it? How has social media been a contributing factor to the uptick?
So I think social media is the key. Most of us spend the majority of our time, looking at our feeds, whether it's established platforms like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter, or even for a younger generation on other platforms. And the same places that my kids spend their time is where my investigators spend their time trying to root out and identify extremism and hate. That's where hatred, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, or more broader glorification of hate, is normal. It's on our phones, it's behind our.
The FBI director, Christopher Wray, is talking about how important it is, the whole growing issue of anti-Semitism is to, and the terror attacks is to the FBI. But there's a big difference in my mind between responding to a shooting or a situation and catching it before it happens. Do you find that the FBI has been effective at sort of helping to stop some of the violence that's gone on, some of the anti-Semitism violence?
Well, I think when we look at sort of extremist violence more broadly, certainly the Jewish community is in the crosshairs, but it's not only the Jewish community. Look at El Paso and the Hispanic community, or other incidents that we see across the country. And I think the FBI is doing a pretty good job, in the sense that, even the last couple of weeks, we have seen several white supremacists in particular who have been arrested for various plots in this country to do damage. Now, that is something that occurs even though domestic extremists are not designated the way, ISIS and Al-Qaeda are. So law enforcement and government has different tools to deal with foreign terrorist organizations. And I think there are steps that can be taken to improve how we understand the domestic terror threat. But I don't think that law enforcement is ignoring it. I just think it's a bigger challenge because so much of what motivates domestic extremists is freedom of speech.
So what are the steps that could be taken?
Listen, we've been advocating at ADL for the Terrorism Prevention Act, which at its base form requires government to at least collect data on extremist domestic terror incidents in this country. You need to have the data before you can resource to the threat. And that's why at ADL we have a heat map where we provide information on terrorist plots and attacks, white supremacist propaganda, which has nearly doubled this past year, 2019, from the previous year, as well as anti-Semitic incidents and other hate types of activity. Data is key to understanding where we put our resources to combat the threat.
And beyond that, do you have some other suggestions? Obviously, that getting data is important, but are there other suggestions that can be used to combat this?
Yeah, I think this requires a holistic approach, right? It's not just law enforcement, it's not just government, but as you mentioned earlier, so much of what is motivating people to violence is the memes and the narratives and tropes that are online that can spread pretty much anywhere at any time. And so the tech industry in and of itself has a responsibility, not just to enforce their terms of services, but to have some corporate responsibility. It's not unreasonable for users of these platforms to expect that they do more to protect their users and, frankly, all the communities.
How do you separate the First Amendment and speech from the hate speech and extremism?
Well, hate speech is very much protected in this country. What we do is try to identify that hate speech in order to find clues of where, violence may be incubated. And so, it's a difficult line. We don't want government to, be able to investigate anybody at any time because of the beliefs that they have. But there are certain clues, certain glorification of violence, certain tropes that really animate these extremist movements that law enforcement needs to make sure that they're on top of. And this is where ADL helps.
Thank you. Oren Siegel from ADL's Center on Extremism. That's all the time we have for today. Stay plugged in by liking us on Facebook at Voice of America. And you can also like my Facebook page at facebook.com/Greta. And follow me on Twitter at Greta. Thanks for being plugged in.